The hit TV series Breaking Bad is about a man's good intentions gone bad. Walter White has a wife, a teenage son, and a new baby girl. He's a very nice man, but he's also a very sick man. He has lung cancer. He's struggling through his life, making a relatively low wage as a high school science teacher, and he has a desire to create a better life for his family. And in his pursuit of creating this better life, he seeks to make more money. So through a series of events, he realizes that with his deep knowledge of chemistry, that he can create, get this, the purest methamphetamine or crystal meth that Albuquerque, New Mexico has ever seen. And that's exactly what he does. He created the best crystal meth ever. However, he gets caught up in the drug industry and things go sideways. You see, he started out wanting to make a few extra dollars for his family, but finds himself becoming a ruthless kingpin in the local drug trade. And his family? Well, when they find out what's happening, they actually turn their back on Walter. But he's not willing to stop. He keeps going and going and going and going until he eventually loses everything. Walter White started off trying to create a better life for his family, but ended up losing his family in the process. This series is a story of a good desire gone bad. Today, we're going to do a deep dive of a good thing gone bad for a church 2,000 years ago. For the next few minutes, we're going to go on a journey to discover how an ancient church had some very good things, had some very good intentions that went sideways. Now, this letter that we're currently studying at Broadway Church was written to a first century church in the ancient city of Corinth, which is located in modern-day Greece. And as we learned last week, the church in Corinth was a bit of a problem child of churches for Paul, who planted this church. Now, Corinth was a city much like Vancouver. It was a place of commerce, a port city where lots of goods came and went. People went to Corinth to be successful. And as a result, the city attracted an unusual amount of resourceful, talented, intense, and ambitious types of people. This church in Corinth reflected the type of person who would live in Corinth. Unfortunately, there was lots of competing and lots of arguing within the church. However, this church was experiencing a lot of good things as well. I mean, they were exercising a lot of spiritual gifts from God, which was amazing. But then things went bad. How? Well, instead of using these spiritual gifts in a way that was productive and God-honoring, some individuals in this church were competing and abusing their spiritual gifts. You might be wondering, well, Lewis, how does someone compete using spiritual gifts? I mean, it's not like it's a sports team or something. I mean, what does abusing spiritual gifts even look like? We're going to get into that in a few minutes, but let's first get on the same page with a few things. First, what is a spiritual gift? Well, if you were here watching at Broadway Church a few weeks ago, here's how we defined it. A spiritual gift literally means something given to the human spirit that has its origins and strength in God. So, what is a spiritual gift used for? Well, Paul actually answered that question in chapter 12, which we studied a few weeks ago. He says this, "Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit, or spiritual gift, is given for the common good." Now, when Paul says that spiritual gifts are for the common good, he means that spiritual gifts are given to edify, meaning to encourage or build up others. Now, God has given Christ followers, you and I, access to spiritual gifts in order to edify others. The heart of a spiritual gift is to be a gift for others. So, what was the problem here in this ancient church? Well, there was two spiritual gifts in particular that were being abused by some members of this church in Corinth. And Paul writes this section of the letter in order to address that issue. The two spiritual gifts were the gift of speaking in tongues and the gift of prophecy. Now, listen. If you're new to church or you're new to faith, you might be thinking, what in the world is the gift of speaking in tongues, and what in the world is the gift of prophecy? Let me briefly explain. First, what is the gift of speaking in tongues? Again, we learned a few weeks ago that speaking in tongues is the supernatural ability to speak words in an unlearned language. What does that even look like? We'll get into that in a moment. First, it's important to know that the gift of tongues is not directed towards other people. It's actually directed towards God. Paul explains this in verse 2. He says, "For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit." Now, when Paul says they utter mysteries by the Spirit, he means that when you pray in tongues in this unlearned language, it is your spirit praying to and praising God directly. Think of it as a God-given, supernatural, personal form of prayer. It's a form of prayer that bypasses the intellect. You don't know what you're saying, but you're praising God. Paul explains it like this. He says, "For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays." Again, it's your spirit praying to and praising God directly. The gift of tongues is also edifying for you. I mean, it's a prayer language between you and God, and it builds you up. So how does this work exactly? Well, God gives the words, but we form and control them. God gives the words, but we form and control them. Look what Paul says regarding having the ability to control these God-given words. He says this, "If anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or at the most 3 should speak at one time, and someone must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God." Now notice this. Notice that Paul gives a rule when individuals are speaking in tongues in a public gathering. He says, if anyone speaks in tongues in a public church gathering and there's no interpreter, no one with the gift of interpretation, the speaker should keep quiet, meaning the speaker has total control over the words that he or she is saying. Now, although God gives the words, the speaker has total control. Now, remember that for later, because this is part of the problem that this ancient church was facing. Okay, so that was the gift of speaking in tongues. What about the gift of prophecy? Well, as we learned a few weeks ago, the gift of prophecy is the ability to declare God's thoughts at a given moment. It's the ability to declare God's thoughts at a given moment. Prophecy is God speaking to and through people. And look what Paul teaches regarding prophecies. He says, "But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort." Now remember what we learned earlier. Spiritual gifts are to be used to edify and encourage and build up others. And that's exactly what Paul says that prophecy does. He says that prophecy edifies others. It's for the strengthening, encouraging, and comfort of others. So how does prophecy work exactly? I mean, how does God communicate his thoughts to us? Well, here's the reality of being a Christ follower. When you're a follower of Christ, God's Spirit lives in relationship with your spirit. And God's Spirit communicates with your spirit. How? Well, there's several ways that God can speak to people. For example, he can speak through dreams, visions. He could even speak through other people. But another way that God can speak to you is through spontaneous thoughts. He'll drop a spontaneous thought into your mind. I mean, I remember a number of years ago, my wife and I, Carrie, we were sitting at a Denny's restaurant, and we were sitting there, and the table across the aisle from us was sitting just an elderly man, and he was sitting there all by himself eating his breakfast. And Carrie, my wife, she felt like God was putting it on her heart just to go and sit with that man for a few minutes and just talk to him, just chat with him. You see, God dropped a spontaneous thought in her mind, and she did just that and was able to have a great conversation, even able to pray with him. I mean, it could be as simple as that. God drops a spontaneous thought in your mind. And here's the key to those spontaneous thoughts. The key is this: the closer you walk with God, the clearer those thoughts will be. You see, an individual with the gift of prophecy, they are experiencing this reality on another level. Individuals with the gift of prophecy are incredibly in tune with God's promptings and God's voice. Now, how does this work at Broadway Church? Well, if you've ever joined us for an in-person gathering, you may have noticed that at times during a worship service, when the band is leading us, an individual will come up to the front row and speak to one of our pastors. And oftentimes these individuals, they feel like they have received a prophetic word from God, meaning that God has dropped a spontaneous prophetic thought into their mind. And they feel like it may be a word of encouragement for our congregation. So they come and share it with the pastor that's hosting that specific worship service. And so what the pastor must do in that moment is that he or she must discern a few things. Is this prophetic word appropriate for right now, or maybe it's for later? If it's for right now, do I bring this individual up on stage and allow them to share this word, or do I go up and share this word on the stage on behalf of that individual? And then we walk it out accordingly. So let me encourage you. If you attend one of our services, one of our gatherings, and you feel like God's giving you a prophetic word during the service, don't feel like you need to keep it in, but don't feel like you need to yell it out either. Please go share that word with the pastor in the front row, as many others have done, and allow us to discern what to do with it. I mean, we want to encourage a dynamic relationship with the Spirit of God. And remember, when a prophetic word is shared, we as a church are encouraged. So share it with one of our pastors. Okay. So do you remember what we said the problem was a few minutes ago? I said people were competing and using these spiritual gifts. They were abusing these spiritual gifts. Well, how was that happening exactly? Apparently, there was an unbridled use of these two gifts, the gift of speaking in tongues and the gift of prophecy. Now, picture what the ancient church in Corinth would look like. I mean, but don't picture Broadway Church, because it didn't have a building like Broadway Church. They were essentially home groups that met together. And so the setting was much smaller and much more intimate than going to a normal church service, even in North America. So picture a meeting with a couple of dozen individuals in a home, and a person begins speaking loudly in a language that nobody knows. Okay, he's speaking in tongues. Great. But as he's doing that, another person pipes up, and she is now loudly speaking in tongues at the same time. And she's now speaking over the first guy. And then the third person raises their voice, and he begins praying in a language that's unknown to anyone. Suddenly we have these three individuals all speaking over one another, and it was chaotic in this home group, in this church. And this was all happening in a relatively small space. Remember what we said earlier. We said when an individual speaks in tongues, they are in total control. So this speaking over one another, it was actually happening on purpose. It seemed like these individuals were trying to flex their spiritual muscles. It seems like these individuals were trying to show the congregation how spiritual they really were. It seemed to be a spiritual competition for some of these Christ followers. And so Paul, the man who planted this church, hears about this competing and this abusing of these spiritual gifts, and he says to himself, listen, that's not how these gifts work. These gifts are not to be used as a sign of spirituality. These gifts are not to be used to show people how godly you are, how godly you want people to think you are. He says, guys, your motives are totally wrong. Remember, spiritual gifts are given to edify others, not to make you look good. So then Paul gives the church in Corinth this advice. He says this: follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. Now, if you're following along in your Bible, underline that, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves, but the one who prophesies edifies the church. I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be edified. Since you are eager, he goes on, for gifts of the Spirit, try to excel in those that build up the church. Now, here's Paul's train of thought for this congregation who are abusing some spiritual gifts. He's thinking this: first, spiritual gifts are given to edify the church, to build up the church. And speaking in tongues, technically speaking, does not edify the church, it edifies you, unless it's interpreted. Therefore, for this situation, in this particular context where abuse of these gifts was taking place, Paul's advice was this. He says, because you're abusing these spiritual gifts, the one who prophesies in this context is, and I quote, greater than the one who speaks in tongues, because prophecy builds others up and speaking in tongues only builds you up. Paul says, I would rather that you prophesy and build someone else up rather than speak in tongues, which only builds you up. Now, it's important to understand that Paul here, he's not bashing speaking in tongues. He's just trying to make a point. I mean, look at his rationale. He says, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. He's like, I use this gift more than all of you. But in the church, I would rather speak 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. His challenge for these Christ followers who have taken spiritual gifts and gone bad with them is this: seek to build others up. The advice to use the gift of prophecy over the gift of speaking in tongues, it's important to know that this is not a principle to all Christ followers at all times in history. This was Paul's advice to this specific church in this specific context who had lost the plot when it came to the use of spiritual gifts. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, Lewis, listen, God bless you. This is an interesting case study of a church that had a good thing go bad. I mean, it's interesting to hear the background information and context and how the Apostle Paul addressed this church 2,000 years ago. But Lewis, how does this apply to me today? How in the world is this relevant to me right now? What can I take from this today? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. At the beginning of chapter 14, Paul encourages the church to eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit. And this is my challenge to you today, to eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit. How do we do that? How do we eagerly desire spiritual gifts? Think about it. How do we eagerly desire anything? What do you do when you really want something? Do you sit around and wait for someone to hand it to you? No. Do you use all your time just to dream about it? No. What you do is you pursue it. I mean, our son Clay, he's 8 years old, and his goal is to play in the National Hockey League. And he's always in the back alley rollerblading and shooting balls in the net and hitting targets, and he's dragging me out there to play with him. He's pursuing this goal, and I hope he makes it because that's my retirement plan. But when you want to be a better hockey player, you skate and you train and you pursue that goal. When you want to get a 90% average in school, you study, you read, and you pursue that goal. When you want to get a promotion at work, you work hard, you go in early, you stay in late, you pursue that goal. Use that same mentality when thinking about eagerly desiring spiritual gifts. Spiritual gifts need to be pursued. So practically speaking, what does that look like? Well, first, do your research. My challenge to you is to study the spiritual gifts in Scripture. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 to 14 that we've been unpacking over the last few weeks. Romans chapter 12, Ephesians chapter 4. Get a study Bible and read on the background and context of those passages. Read the footnotes. Listen to sermons on those specific passages. Re-listen to Pastor Paul's sermon a few weeks ago when he outlined these spiritual gifts. Interact with these passages and dissect them. Research them. And then read the book of Acts in your New Testament Bible to see how the early church functioned in these gifts. The book of Acts explains how some of the first followers of Christ used the gift of healing and faith and tongues and miracles to build up the early church. So dive into these passages. But also, read books on spiritual gifts. You can download the outline on the website, and on the outline I've given you 3 books that you can use as a starting point as you begin reading on this topic. But my point is this: if you want to learn more, you need to do your research. And our pastoral team, we're always here to help. So please feel free to email us and we can help point you in the right direction if you have any questions or concerns. In fact, we would even love to help you find a spiritual mentor to help you guide you through this process. So please reach out to our discipleship team if that interests you. Secondly, familiarize yourself with God's promptings. Now, we learned today that God speaks through spontaneous thoughts. However, oftentimes, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we're too busy to listen to those thoughts. In order to familiarize yourself with God's voice, with those spontaneous thoughts, or in other words, His promptings, you need to create time to meditate and reflect on His Word, to be quiet and to be still in His presence. Think about it. When is the last time that you actually sat still in silence? No phone, no music, nothing. Silence is awkward, isn't it? It's awkward because we never seem to do it. In fact, right after I wrote this message, I drove home from Vancouver to Surrey, and I said, you know what? I need some more quiet time. I need some more silence in my life. And I drove home with the car radio off, and it was awkward. It's hard to get used to that, not having something in the background. Our lives are hurried and hectic. We give no time to reflection and to listen. For Jesus, if you study His life, retreating and spending alone time with God and in solitude was integral to His work and His ministry. He often took time and retreated to be alone with God and in silence. Now, if it was integral for Jesus to do this, how much more is it integral for us to do this? So take time, sit, and be still, reflect, breathe, and listen. That is how we familiarize ourselves with God's promptings. Third, develop a prayer life. Now remember what Paul said in verse 18 about his use of speaking in tongues. He said, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. He used this prayer language to its fullest extent. He used it a lot. And I remember reading that passage years ago, and I thought to myself, I think Paul's onto something here. I think he's onto something. And since pondering Paul's words years ago, I decided to follow his example. I eagerly desired the gift of tongues. And I prayed and prayed and prayed that God would give this gift to me, and He did. And now when I pray in my private prayer life, I mostly pray in tongues. I use this gift. It's incredible. I figure, why should I use my own words when I can tap into this God-given language? He can give me the perfect words to say. You might be thinking, but Lewis, I never heard you speak in tongues before. Well, exactly, because this prayer language, it's between God and I. It's not directed towards people, rather towards God. And so, when developing a prayer life, I would encourage you to ask God for this gift of tongues. It's an incredible gift from God where He can give you the words to say. So let me ask you, do you want to eagerly desire spiritual gifts? Develop a prayer life. Ask God for the gift of tongues. All right, let's wrap up. For the past 3 weeks at Broadway, we've been unpacking these 3 chapters, which were all dedicated towards spiritual gifts. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 13, and 14. We learned what they are, where they're from, and how people tend to misuse them, how they have been misused. And that leads me to today's life hack, which really sums up the last 3 weeks, including today. And here it is. When spiritual gifts are passionately pursued with a humble heart, the church will be built up. You need to know that you have access to some incredible gifts that God wants to give you. Are you pursuing them? Or are you too busy and distracted in your daily life? What are you distracted with? Are you currently functioning in your spiritual gifts? If you are, what's your motivation? Do you have that humble heart that God desires for you? I mean, just imagine for a moment what our church would look like if Christ followers who called Broadway Church home would passionately pursue these gifts with a humble heart. What would that look like? Well, like a healthy body, we would work seamlessly together, pursuing unity and reaching our community. We would see miracles and we would see healings as a regular occurrence in our gatherings, and the church would be built up and encouraged. We would be continuing to plant churches and reach unchurched parts of our city, and the church would be built up and the church would be encouraged. And God would be whispering encouraging words to us and sharing it through us. And the church would be built up and encouraged. I mean, just imagine if we all passionately pursued these spiritual gifts with a humble heart. The church would be built up and God's kingdom would continue to grow. I mean, what an incredible reality that we have access to. So then the question becomes, are you willing to eagerly desire these gifts? If that's you, I want to pray for you right now. I want to pray that God would continue to give you strength to desire those gifts, that you would just have the patience to call on God and to ask Him for these gifts. But I also want to pray for the person that's watching today. Maybe you're sitting there thinking to yourself, you know what? How am I supposed to ask for these gifts? I mean, I'm not even close to God. I mean, how can I eagerly desire these gifts when I'm far away from God? I want to pray for you as well. I want to lead you in a prayer just to say, God, I need you in my life. Maybe today you want to begin your walk with God and begin to access these spiritual gifts that He can give you. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you for everyone watching today. I thank you for the individuals that want to get close to you. God, for those individuals that want to say yes to you right now. I pray that they would give you their hearts. God, that they would turn from their old ways, that they would accept your grace and forgiveness in their life. And I pray that you would give them access to these spiritual gifts, that they would passionately pursue you with a humble heart. God, I thank you for sending Jesus to die on the cross for us so that we can live in this reality. And I pray for all the Christ followers that are watching today. Give them the courage, give them the strength, help them to take the time to pursue these gifts. I pray that you would use us to our fullest extent to access these gifts to build up your church. I pray this in your name. Amen. Amen. Well, if you made a decision to follow God today, the best advice that I can give you is to text the number on the screen. We have a pastor on the other end. We want to help in this decision that you made and help point you in the right direction. Thank you for watching today.